Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. In the last video we spoke about the new meta. I think it's probably time we start building it. Let's go. Last video I laid out what I consider to be the cornerstones and the elements that go into effectiveness in this game, with the enemy getting a say as well. If we're going to build the meta, we may as well start with a build. If we're going to start with a build, then we probably should start with damage. And because my work up to this point has been all with assault rifles, let's see if we can find what the most damaging assault rifle build is. Which AR doesn't really matter at this point in time, because we're comparing the build. We'll start with 44191 as a bullet value. It could be a FAMAS, could be an M4. Could be the Elmos. They're all the same, except if we just multiply that by 50 rounds, we're going to get to the FAMAS or the Elmos. Let's just go with the FAMAS. It's been everybody's favourite for a while. 50 rounds, 2.2 million is what that magazine can dish out. And if we want to do what we came here to do, which is to eliminate threats, let's start with the Elite. What you don't realise is that its health is off the top of the page right now. So we've got a bit of work to do. We've gone through some of this before, but we're going to do a different approach this time. I'm going to explain damage multipliers again, how they work, because it's going to lead into how we work out what the most damaging build is in the game. So 2.2 million for 100k base. We then have our 10% weapon damage from our watch. We then have 6 red cores. Obviously most damaging builds got to be 6 red cores. That's going to give us 15% per core for a total of 100% all weapon damage. Which means that we have a new total of 4.4 million. What I want to point out is how overinvestment in one thing can lead to less effective returns. Potentially not in this case, but I just want to explain how it works here. Our first 10% that we add to our base, it's going to give us a total of 2.43 million. So a true 10% has been added. 220,955, exactly 10% was added to the top. But as soon as we added that 10%, we now had a new value, a new base. It was no longer 2.2 million, it was now 2.43 million. When we added our next 15% of our 100% base, it was 331,000, which is exactly 15% of the base. We added that to the top, and we kept on doing that. But each time, we only added 331,000 each time. This is what additive damage is. So when you hear people talk about additive damage, this is what this is. Our first 220,955 was 10%, and we got a 10% return. That's what we asked for. We added 10%. We wanted a 10% return. That's what we got. Then we asked for 15% return, but we asked for 15% return on 2.4 million, not 2.2 million, but we got a 15% return on 2.2 million, which means that we actually got a 13.63% return. The next 15% that we added was on 125% now, so on and so forth. Each time the percentage of what that base was, because the base had grown at each time, we were getting diminished returns. And when we finally get to 200% or 100% added, if we were to try to add another core, we would only get a 7.5% return. Think about it like a bank. If I rock up to a bank and I ask for a 15% return on $4.4 million, I'm expecting that I'm going to get $662,000. Instead, that bank gives you $331,000. Unfortunately, when you're building, this is the case with every bank. The more that you deposit in the bank, the less that they give you in return. The trick is to go to a different bank, or take from a different bucket. Here's the diminishing returns curve that I've introduced a few times. If we've already got 100% added to our base, we are only going to get a 50% return on our investment. if we had somehow 200% added to our base, then anything invested over that point would be only 33, or at that point would be 33% return on investment. And if we were to somehow get 300% added to our 100% base by some statistic, then anything that we added at that point would only give us a 25% return to our total output of what we invest. So this is an important point when we're building, in that the more that we add of one thing, the less that we are going to get out of the system. But the good thing about damage is that we can start anew. We don't have to add to the same base, a same bucket. I've called them damage buckets before. So base damage, 2.2 million. 100% all weapon damage is another 2.2 million, giving us a total of 4.4 million. If we create a new bucket, in this case obliterate, total weapon damage, which is different to all weapon damage, we now get to use our new base of 4.4 million to start working from. Because we're investing at the new bank, the first investment, the first deposit, they're going to give us the full return. If we add vigilance on top of that, we're no longer getting our 25% return, because we're adding to the same bucket. Our next 25%, although it'll give us 1.1 million, it's a new base that we're working from, 5.5 million. And so that now represents a 20% return. We started at 25, we only get 80% return on that investment. 80% of 25 is 20%. 2.2 million, 100% from our all weapon damage, gave us a total of 4.4. We now have our 50% total weapon damage with a total of 2.2 million, giving us a new starting point of 6.6 million. The good thing about damage is that there's more buckets. Crit damage. Crit damage is dictated by crit chance. Now we can add to 6 pieces of gear 6% for crit chance, 12% for crit damage, and we start our journey with 20% from our watch and crit damage and 10% crit chance, which means that we can add up to 46% crit chance, and we can have 92% crit damage. But when we have our mod slots as well, we can now go up to 64% crit chance, although that won't help because there is a cap at 60%, or we can choose to go to 128% crit damage. Now for the ease of calculations, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 50% crit chance and 100% crit damage. Now because crit damage is the only damage, crit chance is just the chance that it will occur. Damage is the only thing that we're really concerned here with, but we need to know how often it's going to occur to work out what the average is. Now at 12% crit damage, if we have a 50% crit chance, obviously the return is going to be 6%. If we were adding 12% at 100 already on the build, then we would only get a 50% return on that. So that would mean that a 12% crit damage mod would only result in 3% output to the system. But in this case, we've got 50% crit chance, 100% crit damage, which means that we have 50% crit damage, which gives us 3.3 million on top of our new base that we were working from, which was 6.6 million, giving us a new total of 9.94 million. And our 9.94 million is just enough to now kill an elite. But we've also got damage to our targets out of cover, which is another new bucket as well. That's 10%. adds another 994,000 on top of our 9.9 million, and we're now doing 10.9 million in damage. Now, it doesn't matter which order you do these in. Each one is going to be multiplicative with the other bucket. You just have to know what goes into each one of these buckets. I can reverse the order quite easily, have damage to targets out of cover worked out first, crit hit damage next, total weapon damage then, and then I can use my weapon damage all the way at the end. The stepping stones will change, but the end result will be exactly the same. And at each point, each one of those buckets will be multiplicative exactly the same way, and each individual part that added into each bucket will provide those diminishing returns that we've already discussed. But there are more buckets. Now, for an AR build, I think we can all agree that the most damage that we could add at this point is by taking the 100 stacks on offer from the amplified damage of the Strikers set. It's probably worth mentioning for new players that although Strikers reads as providing total weapon damage, it is in fact providing amplified damage, a new bucket altogether. 4 pieces of Striker is going to give us 65% at 100 sacks. And then we have the opportunity to take the backpack as well, which will ramp that up to 100. Let's have a look at that. What a lot of people don't realize is that the backpack talent, although being amplified, is adding to an existing bucket. We're investing in the same bank. It's only a new talent that will create a new bucket. So the 35% amplified damage that you're adding at the end is not amplified damage or a new amplification factor. It is adding to the existing bucket that you've already got. So we start at 65% amplified damage. That takes us to 18 million total. But right now we have vigilance on the backpack. And what you realise is that the bucket for the Strikers gear set is already more full than what the total weapon damage bucket is, which means that the Strikers gear set is going to receive more diminished returns. Let's go ahead and do those calculations and see what the new total is. What we now have is a new total 18.2 million, only just ahead of what we had with an additional 25% from vigilance. 25% total weapon damage versus 35% amplified damage, as many people have confusingly called it before, makes very little difference at all. And that is because diminished returns. The Strikers at 65 starts at a disadvantage because now that additional 35% is being diminished to 60% of its original value, meaning that it is 21% to the output of the system. The vigilance, starting from the base that Obliterate was providing, is only 25, which means it's only diminished to 80% of its original value, meaning that its output is 20%. Now we will discuss vigilance further in detail later, but at this point in time, the Striker's chest has the highest damage output. What about the Obliterate chest piece versus the Striker's chest piece? I will discuss Glass Cannon later, but right now Obliterate is definitely the most popular. The Obliterate chest piece in its entirety was providing 18.2 million worth of mag damage. What is the Striker's chest going to offer us? 10% damage to targets out of cover, nothing changes there, nothing changes to the weapon damage or the crit hit damage. I've had to shrink the scale here in order to fit 200% amplified damage on the page, because that is now giving us 14.5 million on top, but we lost our 25% total weapon damage, and now our total is 21.8 million. 3 million clear of the Obliterate chest piece. So the Striker's chest piece is the most damaging build at full stacks. And how do you assess whether or not taking that extra damage is worth it versus the speed with which obliterate can generate damage? Well, I did an interesting experiment and put it into a graph. Here what we've got is 5 seconds worth of stacking time followed by 10 seconds worth of downtime. Now take this with a pinch of salt and take it as you see fit. I just thought it was an interesting experiment to see how this all played out when there were breaks in the system or if you were able to stack. And as you can see, the Strikers is actually able to generate quite a deal more of amplification to the build at full stacks. The problem is building it. Now, obliterate, as you can see, if there is short periods of building followed by long periods of downtime, and stacks are allowed to degenerate all the way down to 0, which can happen quite often in the open world, then obliterate is going to be considerably better than what the Striker's chest piece is going to be. But if we look at something like a legendary mission where you have the ability to continue to build stacks through an extended period of time, and then there's only a short period of downtime, then it's very possible that the Striker's chest piece could be a better option. I'm going to leave that to you. I'm just building, investigating along the way, and I'll leave it up to you as to which you believe is best for the content that you're playing. There is the possibility to game the system with regards to Striker stacks, so that's one thing to consider. And given that on a 900 RPM weapon system, it only took 10 seconds of building for the Striker's chest piece to have the equivalent damage of the obliterate, there's also this bit where there's more than 5 seconds in between targets, then obliterate drops completely. Whereas the Striker's stacks, although they're degenerating from full stacks at 3 stacks per second, that's 33 seconds before a Striker's chest piece 200 stacks will degenerate down to 100 stacks. And at the beginning of a new engagement, if there's still stacks remaining, then that is a considerable difference in damage to start the fight off with. Like I said, just food for thought. You be your own judge. I'm just going to build along the way. But for now, I'm sticking with the Striker's chest piece as being the most damaging build. Now, if you are considering going with the obliterate chest piece, just ignore the other pieces that are on here. We're looking at obliterate and 4 pieces of Strikers. Well, what about 4 pieces of Heartbreaker and a total weapon damage talent like Vigilance on the backpack now? Both builds have 25% total weapon damage. Both builds will have 15% weapon handling. The difference is Heartbreaker will come with 15% assault rifle damage. Now, it's going to be very much diminished, but it is going to be able to produce a higher total magazine damage. But Striker's 15% rate of fire means that is going to deliver that damage 15% faster. Heartbreaker will lose 2 stacks for each second, whereas Strikers will only do that between 50 and 100 stacks. But Heartbreaker has the advantage of bonus armor on top. We'll probably have to investigate this another day, because then we'll also have to look at the differences between taking Gunner as a specialization and taking Ignition as a specialization, and the value of weapon talents then also become a factor, something we haven't gotten into yet. But just letting you know, if Heartbreakers is your favorite, it's on my to-do list. We'll get around to it. And for all of those people that have been screaming and calling me a moron, it's okay. It's time. Pristine example versus the Striker's chest piece. Let's take a look. Now, in the last couple of examples, we could in fact ignore crit chance, crit damage if we wanted to, because there was no variation between the builds. But when it comes to this comparison, we absolutely have to take it into account, and therefore we're going to actually have to put these on real builds to see what it is that we can actually get out of them. So we were looking at 21,874 for Striker's Chest, but when we put it on a build, so let's have a look at the build. So we're just going to use Seska and Grupo as our control, and the stats for this build are going to be 59,144, and ignore the expertise, we're not considering weapons at the moment. It's 130% all weapon damage. And so now what we've got is still 10% damage to targets out of cover, and now we've got an average of 85% crit hit damage, 130% all weapon damage. We still don't have any total weapon damage, but we've got our 200% amplified damage, which means that the total mag damage for the Striker's Chest build is in fact 31 million. Now, the difference between the two builds is the extra 100% amplified damage, but as we know now, that is in fact additive, because it's in the same bucket with the rest of the Striker stacks, versus 60% total weapon damage into a brand new bucket. So what that means is that Strikers at 100%, the additional 100% on top of that is now receiving 50% diminished returns, meaning a 50% return, but the Perfect Focus has no diminished returns whatsoever, so it will be a pure 60% return on investment, which should see it free and clear. But there are a couple of differences when it comes to the build. So in order to access Pristine Example Perfect Focus, I'm going to have to use an 8x scope. So we have a 30% headshot scope on. Obviously I need to put my Pristine Example chest piece on. And I'm going to lose out on Grupo, so I'm going to lose crit damage definitely. And where does that put us? 6105, and an extra crit damage mod is going to put us at 6117. Same weapon damage. So what that means now is we have 100% base, 10% damage to targets out of cover, and now an average of just 70% crit hit damage, 130% all weapon damage, and 60% total weapon damage, with just 100% amplifier, but that takes it up to 30,446,000. So it is very, very close. So we probably really need to do some investigation, and this could come down to personal taste, but there's a few other things that we'll investigate. But it's a slight win at this stage for the Striker's Chest, but there's a couple of things to consider here. How long does it take to build Perfect Focus, and how long does it take to build Striker stacks, the additional 100 Striker stacks? Well, you've also got the fact that you can build Perfect Focus prior to entering an engagement, which a lot of people will see this as being a massive advantage. But if you're a speedrunner, you're clearly going to be concerned with how long it takes you to build stacks and how that affects your damage, but also your speed. So that's one thing, but then a general player isn't going to be concerned about that. They're going to stack as much damage as they possibly can before going into the engagement, and they're not going to be so concerned about losing those stacks in between areas. Do we include that time? I don't know, because although I can build Perfect Focus prior to entering the first stage of a legendary DUA, for instance, I can also build stacks with Strikers before entering the first stage of a legendary DUA. So what I decided to do was to go in the middle of that. I built my Striker stacks, transferred to the mission as quickly as possible, and recorded how much I could build my Striker stacks up until when the first helicopter came. I then did the same thing for the perfect focus build. So I built my striker stacks in the firing range, transferred immediately to the mission, and then went and started building my perfect focus as quickly as I possibly could before engaging, and then all the way up until the first helicopter came. And this is what that looked like. Okay, and you can take this with a pinch of salt because every run is going to be completely different. In this first run, I lost my shield once, so but I just found it interesting in that I started the mission at over 100 stacks, and you can see my first bullet landed is at 575,399, and from that we can actually work out that I had 111 stacks at that point in time. And then you can see my last bullet in the bottom right striking a target when the helicopter turned up, and that guy that was suppressed was a pain in the ass. But by contrast, we have the perfect focus, and you can see my first bullet hitting in the top left and my last bullet hitting in the bottom right. But the difference is the start and the finish. We actually can work out what my starting stacks were for the beginning of this one. It was 43 stacks. And at the end, I was pushing 100. I went back over the footage again, and it seemed that I was, at least in the run with the perfect focus, I was holding 100 a lot better than I certainly was holding 200 with the striker's chest. But again, it's run dependent. Now you might be inclined to think that missing stacks from the striker's build hurts more than it does on the Pristine example build, and you might also be inclined to think that as time passes, the strikers loses more damage because it's losing more stacks per second. That's not the case. Missing stacks from the Pristine example build hurts way more than it does from the striker's build. Because if we go back to how much those striker stacks were adding to each one of those builds, the striker's build has built 200 stacks for 200% amplified damage, and it was contributing 20.6 million to the build. For the Pristine example, it was 100% amplified damage, and it was contributing 15.2 million to the build, with perfect focus doing the rest of the lifting. Well, what that means is that for every missing stack, it represents only 0.5% of the striker's damage, meaning that each stack lost equates to only 103,000. Whereas for the Pristine example, a missing stack represents 1%, a full 1% of its damage, equaling 152,000. So missing stacks from the Pristine example build hurts more than it does the strikers. And as far as the degradation over time goes, strikers loses 3 stacks, Pristine loses 2, which basically makes their degradation rate exactly the same. Here is the first bullet striking, and what I worked out as well, because I could work out how many stacks there were, I also was able to work out how many seconds it took me to get from the firing range to first bullet strike, and it looks like my load times on the perfect focused was much better as well, because it should have taken me 10 seconds to stack that, and yet I'm only 8 seconds apart for the first bullet. So there's those variances as well. But what it meant was that even with that load time difference, the strikers took a 7% damage advantage into the start of the fight. But at the end of the fight, the last bullet, the perfect focus had an 8% damage advantage. So I think we're probably going to see that over the time period that the damage output was pretty similar. And if I imagine that both builds built their stacks from their starting point consistently, and there was no breaks and all the rest of it, I can actually graph that. And this is what this looks like. So the Pristine example will reach its maximum sooner, after about 4 and a bit seconds. And then it will be at a very slight disadvantage as those stacks are held at their peak. Remembering that when perfect focus is at full power, each stack of the strikers that the perfect focus is building represents a larger value, 150,000, versus the strikers 100,000. So its incline, once that perfect focus is stacked, is much faster. But then during the battle, any drop of stacks is going to hurt Pristine example more than what the strikers does. Degradation over time is negligible. But for me, the big difference is there's a couple of things. I mean, I hate perfect focus. I hate looking down a scope and not having the situational awareness. In my first run with the striker's chess piece, I took my shield broke at one point. What that meant was that I was disrupted. I was also, at one point as well, able to move out of the way of a grenade because I had the freedom and had the situational awareness to see it incoming and move out of the way. And this is the big difference for me. Although my shield didn't break and I didn't take a grenade with my Pristine example run, if I had, or at any time I want to move to a new location and do that quickly, I'm going to lose that full perfect focus buff. This is what happens. You lose a significant amount of your damage. It is an instant wipe of the buff, and you then have to spend 10 seconds building it all the way back up again. So for me, despite ignoring the scope issues that I have and the standing behind a dumpster thing, I like the freedom to maneuver as well, and if I want to hold that buff, I can't. As soon as I drop my shield and start to run, that buff is going to disappear and I'm going to have to build it up again when I get to my new location. So that for me is a loss, an L in the Pristine example phases, and especially when damage is so close as it is, even at their peak. For me, that's a big one. And also, if I'm not using Pristine example, don't have to worry about buffing it. I can do cool stuff like this. There's still a few more differences in the build that we can explore. So, in a previous episode on a Coyote's Mask, I showed that an optimal setup for a 4-piece striker's build included Coyote's Mask with one Seska piece. And that optimal setup, as opposed to a 59-144 with chess scope Gruppo, the optimal setup was a 47% crit chance, 153% crit damage option for a striker's build, raising the average crit damage output from 84.96 to 89.46. When we look at the Pristine example perfect focus option, we are now losing our Seska from the build completely in order to use the Coyote's Mask. We go from our 60-117 Seska to 50% crit chance and 117% with Coyotes. But with all the buffs, that actually ekes out a marginal advantage for the Coyote's Mask. But there are some other setups that we can explore. 44% crit chance, 129 crit damage, and 38, 141. When we do the numbers, both of them are almost identical, and both of them are better than the 50-117 setup. So whether or not you would choose 44-129 or 38-141, I think given the distances that you're likely to engage with for a perfect focus build, staying at range is generally what you want to do so that you don't get swamped from your lack of situational awareness. You're probably actually going to want to go for a 38-141 setup, as crazy as that sounds. But in either case, we've increased from 70.2 up to 73.4% for average crit damage output. And when you do the numbers for the striker's chest, 31.78 8 million is now the total magazine damage output. And for perfect focus, it managed to sneak over the 31 million mark. So the striker's chest went from 84.96% average crit damage output to 89.46, from just over 31 to 31.78 million for total mag output. And perfect focus went from 70.2 average crit damage output to 73.4, taking it from 30.44 million over the 31 million mark for total damage output. Total magazine damage output, that is. And that's an important point, magazine damage output, because we still need to work out the weapons factor. Perfect focus can only be accessed by certain weapons. And if you saw my best AR video, the St. Elmo's is the best at multiple target damage and also single target damage as well. So what we need to explore is whether or not looking down a scope and access to a weapon damage talent and headshots for a perfect focus build versus a St. Elmo's version of these builds, which one is more effective? Because although I can't access a 30% headshot damage increase with a St. Elmo's, if I want to, I can put a headshot scope on my striker's chest piece build, but I'm going to lose 5% crit chance by doing that. And currently, there's only 2.5% difference between these two builds. And currently, we're only looking at weapon damage, and only on a single target. I think there's probably a couple of other builds that are probably going to put up a good fight as being the highest damage output. But will they be the most effective? I'll continue the search in the next one. If you like this video, although we've covered some old topics, I hope you got something new out of it. Please hit the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe. I will see you in the next one on our search for the new meta. Fog out.